When people think about queer history in the United States, they often think of the first places like New York or San Francisco. But the history of queer activism, community, and struggle has never been confined to the coasts. It's also been made in places like Kansas City and Springfield, in local organizations, in political campaigns, in community spaces, and in the archives that preserve those lives and stories. Recovering that history helps us see that queer history is not some marginal side note to the American past. It is part of the history of citizenship, rights, community, and social change in the United States. Today we are exploring how that history has been preserved, what queer activism looked like in the Midwest, and why these stories are so significant to understanding the broader history of the American experience. I'm Djene Badgerland.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History.
Today's guest is Stuart Hinds, Curator of Special Collections and Archives at the Miller Nichols Library at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He also serves as curator of the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America, a collecting initiative he co-founded in 2010 to preserve and make accessible the history of Kansas City's LGBT communities. Stuart has spoken widely on topics related to queer history and archives, co-taught the first course on U.S. gay and lesbian history at UMKC, and is currently working on a book titled Cowtown Queers, A History of Gay and Lesbian Kansas City. Stuart Hinds, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you.
So how did you first become interested in history and archival work? What drew you into the world of the past, and how did you turn that into a career?
Well, I got a bachelor's degree in history as a young person, and then with the intent to go on to library school. And in library school, I got a student job at the Iowa Women's Archive and was exposed to archival work and the unique nature of that kind of activity. And once out of school, was hired into a special collections department at the Kansas City Public Library, their rare books and archives unit, and have been doing it ever since.
So it sounds like the physical stuff actually excites you. Yeah, like being able to get to those primary sources, to examine them, to keep them alive for other scholars to see.
Working with the material, and the best part is connecting people with the material.
Yeah.
And enabling them to make the discoveries that they end up making.
So you grew up here in Springfield. Did that background shape how you later thought about queer life and community in the Midwest and in the interior part of the U.S.?
It did. One of the things that I have long found frustrating personally about American queer history is that it is so coastal focused. And knowing that there's a significant community in the interior part of the country, it was important to me to make that known to a wider range of people.
So your journey into archive studies kind of opens up a bigger question about how communities preserve their past. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America, how it was set up, why it begun, and what is the specific need it is kind of trying to fill in?
Sure. We formed GLAMA as a partnership originally. It was a partnership between the university and with the Kansas City Museum, which is a museum of history, and our local county historical society, the Jackson County Historical Society. And with the intent that paper stuff would come to the archive, the museum, which was set up to handle artifacts, would handle artifacts that we received, and the society would help with promotion and programming. Unfortunately, within the first 5 years, both of those partners stepped back. And so since that time, it has been a university-led initiative. And it has surpassed our wildest expectations in terms of material coming in from folks in the community and material being used by different kinds of researchers, our faculty and students and community researchers. And we've clearly tapped a community that is eager to preserve its history. And as a member of that community, it's equally important to me to preserve those stories as well. And so it's been remarkably gratifying just to see how successful it has been and seriously to see the fascinating range of projects that have come out of the collections.
So I have a kind of couple of questions to put to you here about some of the specifics about that. So, how do you actually build an archive like that in a practical sense? What kind of materials are you collecting, and what kind of things survive as materials that can be used in an archive, and what kind of things are the hardest things to recover when you're trying to build an archive and preserve the history of a particular community?
When we started, because it was a brand new thing, we had to do a lot of promotion. So we had a booth at Pride, we had a booth at AIDS Walk. We would go and talk to literally anybody about it, just to get the words out into the community. And then when we would meet with donors to talk about the stuff that they wanted to give us, 9 times out of 10 they would say, "Oh, well, you should talk to person ABC because they were involved in XYZ." And so then we'd go talk to person A, and they would refer us to more people, and person B, and they would refer us to more. And so that's really how it kind of snowballed in terms of stuff coming in. The large proportion of the collection, of course, is paper-based. It's lots of photographs, it's organizational papers, it's publications, community publications, just a wide range of material. And because it is a new archive that is documenting a community for the first time ever, much to the chagrin of the people I work with, I tend to err on the side of taking too much from people, because there's a balance when you're working with donors given to an archive. You have to navigate what has research value. And because it's new, I don't know what's going to have research value 25, 50 years from now. So again, I tend to err on taking on too much. But also, because I have been in the very, very fortunate seat to have seen everything come in, I know how a new accession relates to other material that exists in the collection already. So I can make those connections, and I try to make those connections for the donors and for the people I work with and for our users, so that every little piece, no matter how small, helps to contribute to the overall story.
And is this archive open to the public, or is it so anyone can use it if they're interested?
Yes, we are open to the public.
I do have kind of a process piggyback here. I am curious. I assume that if we were to make a scatter plot of all of your materials, there's going to be probably 1950 to the year 1999 is going to be a big dense blob. Anything before that is going to be kind of sparse. And then after that, personal papers probably start to taper off a bit because, I mean, for one, not quite sure if they're of research use yet. That history may not be made. It may not be tied in. But also, because of the nature of how everything is digital now, a lot of stuff doesn't get ever put on paper. Tons of words and thoughts and lived experiences exist, on the internet now in ways that they used to exist in diaries. How are you navigating the 21st century and preserving, the last 30 years of community building online?
One of the earlier questions was about what's the hardest to preserve, and it is the digital. It is very, very easy, as you all know, to create things digitally. It is really, really hard to preserve them long term. And the field is really struggling with trying to find ways to make that happen. Because just as you said, for the past about 30 years, everything has shifted. No one is printing flyers anymore. Mm-hmm. Everything is promoted on Instagram or Facebook or whatever outlet it might be. And unless archives are resourced to go out and seek that stuff out and preserve it, it's going to disappear.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, I guess I am a little bit curious as kind of a nerd, I guess, is what's the easiest way to preserve that stuff? I mean, do you take the digital and physically print it and save the prints? Do you PDFs? I know, data loss over time, stuff it's tough.
Right. There are arguments in the field that there's metadata attached to every digital file that is important information about that file. And so when you print something out, you don't get that metadata.
Right.
So there's that argument. And, we've all seen, if you've been around long enough, you've seen files that you can no longer open because you don't have the software that was used to create that file, let alone getting it off a 5 1/4-inch floppy disk.
Right.
So it's a massive issue in the world of archives, and it will be the next generation's problem to solve. They're not going to solve it before I retire.
Right.
So it's going to eat up a lot of, and has eaten up a lot of energy and a lot of thought.
I am glad to hear that it being discussed and thought about and worked through.
Absolutely.
I know that so much community has been built online, especially in these marginalized communities where people often, especially being from small town myself, like, it's hard to build that kind of community often in the geographic place that you are, and the internet has made it so much easier so there's so much richness there to document. It will be interesting to see what we have in 100 years.
Yeah.
So one of the things that is quite striking here is that archives, they dictate about what history or histories can be even written or even taught about. So one of the things I would ask is, you've taught queer American history before. So what does teaching that course help us understand about sort of the place of queer history in U.S. history more broadly, and sort of how do you bring the archives in? Do students work with archival sources? Because I'm assuming there's a lot of secondary literature that has been written, but certainly compared to other fields in history, there's probably relatively little written, at least in a broader sense.
Well, and particularly when it comes to the central part of the country, we do bring in the archive as much as possible. The way that I teach queer American history is I teach it as sort of the emergence of a community and then that community's struggle for civil rights. And it parallels the civil rights stories that the students have been exposed to before, the ones they know. It's just new. It's new players. It's new events. It's a new timeline. And it's interesting because I've only ever taught it really in Kansas City, but when I do bring in the Kansas City stories, those tend to have the most resonance with the students because it's their city, it's the neighborhood they walk through to get to school, and that tends to be most powerful.
Do students tend to be surprised about sort of how deep the history of the queer community in the Midwest is? Because you've laid it out that we can look at it within the context of the civil rights movement, but even with the civil rights movement, we focus on sort of certain geographical areas. In terms of, like you said, the resonance to people, is that often a surprise to students, or do they maybe know about it? The type of students who will take this course, will they already know things?
No, they don't. They don't know. They don't know these stories. They don't know this history. For several years, I taught it as a gen ed class, and so I had students from across disciplines, and it was sort of generically titled history class, and then the teacher could teach whatever content they wanted. And so when we got to the AIDS crisis, I would always ask, how many of you have talked about this in previous history courses? And of a class of about 90, maybe 6 hands went up. And so even relatively recent history they don't know about. And so it is surprising to them. It is enlightening. And for a number of them, it's very enriching.
I would, just as an aside, be curious to know the current state of like high school history pedagogy, because 20 years ago when I went through high school, we spent a whole lot of time talking about the particulars of Civil War battles, and then we barely got to Lyndon Johnson, and that was the end of American history right there. And a whole lot has happened even at that time since, and in the 20 years intervening, it has been, history won't just stop. So,
and that has been my observation, just very casually observed, that most of the introductory history courses get through the 60s, and that's about as far as they get, which of course now is a very long time ago.
Yeah. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was kind of just the America
right
thumbs up. So we've already mentioned this, but it bears repeating and addressing directly. We've there is this assumption, maybe it's just because of the available material and the scholarship's focus, but there's this assumption that all the queer activism that moved forward this civil rights movement over the second half largely of the 20th century was happening on the coasts, right? So obviously, I mean, your whole collection and your whole career is set to correcting that assumption. Tell us more about it. What's the meat and potatoes of queer activism in the Midwest?
Well, many people believe that the struggle for queer civil rights start with the Stonewall Uprising in June of 1969. Because a lot of people have heard about Stonewall, rightly so. It was a pivot in that struggle, but there was 20 years of activism that led up to Stonewall. And it was in that movement that Kansas Cityans had a very important role. The movement itself called itself the homophile movement. And there were groups that got started out in California that spread across the country. They had chapters across the country. And eventually the groups on the East Coast became as large and as powerful as the groups on the West Coast. And in Kansas City, there was a more independent homophile group called the Phoenix Society for Individual Freedom, but they got involved in this national movement, interestingly, in large part because they had access to a printing press.
Okay.
And this is a world of print, and that's how you communicated. And so members of the Phoenix became the information clearinghouse for the homophile movement, which meant that groups across the country could send their materials to Kansas City to then be printed and distributed from the center of the country. And it was in these materials that these groups communicated with their members. So it was a really surprisingly pivotal role for this very small group of Kansas Cityans to take on and to manage for a number of years leading up to the Stonewall Uprising.
I mean, that alone warrants and necessitates an archive, let alone all of the stories that surround it and everything. I mean, just being that central source of all of that literal printed paper.
Right.
I mean, yeah, that's great. That's really fascinating. I'd never even heard of it.
And that's from this seat, that's one of the exciting things and the most fun things about doing this kind of work is just bringing these stories to light and sharing them with folks, because many people, most people, have not heard of them.
Yeah, we've gotten so disconnected from the idea of a newspaper. Like, I mean,
right.
there used to be so many periodicals in this country, it kind of boggles the mind whenever you start digging into like an archive. And I imagine that you've uncovered all kinds of niche publications that nobody's ever seen before.
And it's absolutely true, and it's challenging to convey to young people who have grown up in a digital world just how prevalent print publications were and what it took to communicate through print as opposed to instantly through the device in your pocket.
So this is all culminating now in a book about all of this, about Kansas City and its queer communities over the years. Tell us about the narrative thread of this, the Cowtown Queers.
So it has shifted focus over time. It's been going on for a while. And it really is going to look at activism from early, a little bit in the 50s, but primarily from the 60s through the 90s, and just the different stripes of activism that emerged over that time, how they parallel stuff going on nationally, how they're connected to the national narrative, and then the unique facets of some of the activism that took place, particularly in the 1990s. The 1990s were a really, really, really ripe period of activism in Kansas City and in the country.
Why were the 90s so pivotal? Why did it take up to the 1990s for the movement to gain a lot more acceptance?
I think part of it stems from the rise of AIDS in the previous decade and the sort of immediate need for direct and confrontational activism to try and get some sort of response to the health crisis. And then that the success of some of that activity leads to consideration of taking on other kinds of broader kinds of issues within the queer community and copying the tactics, but looking at other different issues. And you see that reflected again on the national scene but also in Kansas City as well.
What were some of those broader issues specific to the community?
In particular, there were things like censorship. There were things like broader civil rights, trying to employment and treatment in the military, and recognition of domestic relationships. Those kinds of things that we see being transformed in the subsequent decade and the decade after. But those conversations really started in the 90s.
In the 90s, were there any organizations that really stand out in Kansas City as, paving the way for future activism, or is it more of just like the broad strokes of the movement just were all kind of flourishing at once in that time period?
There were different kinds of things that were flourishing simultaneously. Some of the ones that drew the most attention and had the most success include the group, it was called the Human Rights Ordinance Project, and then ultimately the Human Rights Project. And what they focused on was trying to secure passage of a city ordinance that would prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and or HIV status. And they encountered insane opposition to what it was they were trying to do. And ultimately they succeeded, but it took a number of years for that to happen. At the same time that's going on, you've got local organizations that take on the censorship that stems from the federal government in visual arts and in distribution of music. And you've got a really interesting initiative called Womantown, which was an effort to take a neighborhood in Kansas City and create what they billed as an intentional urban women's community. The founders swear up and down they weren't separatists, but they were de facto separatists. And it was quite successful for a number of years in the 90s. They advertised internationally. They got inquiries from all around the world about this project, because what they wanted to do was to encourage women, in particular lesbians, to come and either buy property or rent property in the neighborhood to help build that community. And if you were a member of Womantown and the property that you bought needed rehabilitation, then you would get help from the other members of Womantown.
It's fascinating. I would be remiss if I didn't bring it back to the Ozarks. I always try to find a way to on this show. I'm curious what your archive holds from, not even necessarily Springfield, but maybe even farther flung, West Plains, Poplar Bluff, the area. I'm curious what treasures the archive holds for this little neck of the woods.
Well, to be honest, we're pretty not restricted, but we try to limit ourselves geographically to the Kansas City region.
Gotcha.
And we have received some material from a group of women in Columbia. They particularly wanted their stuff in GLAMA. And we have a little bit of stuff around from Topeka. But there is an archive here at Missouri State.
Missouri State, yeah.
And so we don't want to step on their toes.
Understood, yeah.
And there's another archive in St. Louis, and so we tend not to collect St. Louis material as well.
Understood.
Yeah.
So, as a kind of final question, in our current political moment, and more broadly in understanding of U.S. history, what is at stake with the preservation and broader understanding of queer history?
Well, most immediately, what's at stake is the documentation of these lives as they are under attack and are trying to be erased by certain forces. And that effort to erase those experiences is completely undermined if you've got a repository like this, if you've got the documentation, if you've got the record, and therefore it's not going to go away. And you can't erase these lives if you have those records.
Well, thank you, Stuart Hinds, for joining us this month. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and it's heartening to hear the people are out there preserving this history. I mean, I think that's something that's really spoken to me over the last several years of doing this show, is that you can't do the history if there's no sources. And so the archivist's role is so crucial to the whole process. So it's fascinating to finally get to pick an archivist's brain about all this, and the queer history of Middle America being a particularly interesting angle. So thank you very much for joining us. And listeners can keep an eye out for that book, Cowtown Queers, A History of Gay and Lesbian Kansas City. You've been listening to Talking History, a production of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. You can listen to this episode or our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. Join us first Thursday of the month, 12:06 after NPR News. See you next time.